Hi, my name's Daniel Kitts. I'm a producer with The Agenda with Steve Paikin. And with the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting taking place in Sri Lanka this weekend, we at The Agenda are re-examining the political situation in that country as it continues to rebuild after a decades-long civil war. And right now I'm joined by Fred Carver. He's the campaign director of the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice. Thank you so much for joining me.
Real pleasure.
The first thing I want to ask you about is, obviously in Canada, the focus with respect to the meeting, also known by the acronym CHOGM, is that Canada's Prime Minister Stephen Harper has chosen not to attend the event himself due to concerns over the rule of law and human rights issues in Sri Lanka. What do you think of his decision?
I welcome the decision. It was something we called for the Canadian Prime Minister to do. We called for every head of government to do. And for a long time, actually, I have to pay credit to the Canadian Prime Minister for being the only real world head of state, or certainly Commonwealth head of state, willing to strongly campaign on this issue. He wasn't entirely alone, but at times he certainly looked alone, particularly as the key committee of the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, or CMAG, has a very anti-human rights agenda, and Canada was the sole voice on that committee with a pro-human rights agenda. I think it's the right decision. I think it was a big mistake, the Commonwealth Summit being held in Sri Lanka, but once that decision had been made, I think it was inevitable that it would be used for political purposes by the regime and used to shore up the legitimacy of the president. And I think it's just incumbent upon all world leaders who are invited to not play into that political dynamic. And I think the best way to do that is to stay away. So no, I thought he made the right choice.
The counter-argument to the Prime Minister, to the Prime Minister's decision, is that what Sri Lanka needs now is engagement with the international community, and actions like this only further alienate the Sri Lankan leadership from working with the international community. What's your response to that concern?
I mean, I agree that what Sri Lanka needs right now is engagement with the international community. I think we have to be very careful as to what engagement means and where engagement comes from. And I think the United Nations Human Rights Council is putting down a really powerful marker as to how engagement with the international community should occur. It should occur with benchmarks and with a sort of serious program which gets to the issues of reconciliation and justice. I mean, to be honest, the Commonwealth is not really the agency which is best placed to be delivering reconciliation in Sri Lanka. And I think the idea that the Commonwealth Secretariat can solve the deep-seated structural problems in Sri Lanka through this Good Offices program is rather wishful thinking. And I think it's absolutely important that Canada engages with Sri Lanka, but I think there's a difference between engaging constructively with Sri Lanka and attending a two-day jamboree in which you're not allowed to discuss the big issues, you're certainly not allowed to raise reconciliation and justice, and you're essentially there to be photographed in support of the Sri Lankan president. And I think it's very important that that Canada engage bilaterally with Sri Lanka, but Senator Segal, the special envoy to Sri Lanka, has been doing that.
Now, you mentioned, obviously, reconciliation. That's obviously the reconciliation process in Sri Lanka following the Civil War is a big focus for your campaign. Why are you dissatisfied with the process thus far?
I think it's even more being dissatisfied by the lack of progress. I think we're very concerned the direction of travel is in the wrong direction. I think that the language of reconciliation is being used as a screen, and behind the screen what's actually happening is the institutionalization of a completely unsustainable mechanism for governing the North, which is essentially to keep the North under a form of military occupation, with soldiers on every street corner and the Tamil community essentially suppressed. And that's not what lasting peace and reconciliation looks like. And although we're not alarmists and we don't think there's any chance of return to war anytime soon, we do know that that lasting peace comes from a just peace. And given we don't have a just peace, we're very, very concerned that we might be, admittedly only at the beginning, but on the road back towards war.
Obviously, I think it's fair to say that it's hard to imagine that this reconciliation process would have ever been easy, given
Mhm.
how difficult the war was for everyone involved. The Sri Lankan government has created a Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. Doesn't that represent some steps toward a meaningful effort?
I mean, the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission was a really interesting commission. It produced a really interesting document. I mean, let's be very, very clear. The main problem in Sri Lanka is a culture of impunity. That culture of impunity causes many of those in positions of authority to believe they can get away with murder because they did, and it allows human rights violations to go on a systemic and ongoing basis. Now, that culture of impunity comes from a lack of accountability for the war crimes, the crimes against humanity that took place in 2009. The Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission completely failed to take that into account. It didn't even address that question. But the LLRC did actually come up with some really good, sensible recommendations as to how other aspects of the Sri Lankan state could be reformed. So it ignored the elephant in the room. Nevertheless, it did make some quite good recommendations. However, almost none of the recommendations and none of the substantive recommendations of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission have been implemented. They set up an action plan to implement the commission. The action plan was only ever going to implement about a third of the recommendations, and it hasn't even really implemented very many of them. And it hasn't made any substantive progress that I can see towards meaningful implementation of the Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. So I think it was a noble, if flawed, endeavour, but let's not fall into the government of Sri Lanka's trap of pretending that the LLRC recommendations are something which exists anywhere else than on paper.
Now, you've already mentioned this in passing, the issue of neo-militarization. Maybe you could expand a bit about that, because that's another concern of your organization.
Yes, I mean, we're very concerned that the Sri Lankan army, which grew in size dramatically in order to win the civil war, has continued to grow in size in peacetime. And it's clear now that this is no longer an army which is developed with the means of winning a war. This is an army that is developed with multiple aims, one of them being commercial. The army is increasingly involved in farming, in the tourism industry, and in various other sorts of domestic commercial pursuits. The army exists largely to give the executive greater power. So the president is himself commander-in-chief of the army, but on a day-to-day basis, the army is run by his brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And between the two of them, they really can use the army to circumvent all the checks and balances which would normally exist in the Sri Lankan constitution and rule as a state within a state. Increasingly, also, we're concerned about the fact that the military is taking on things which should be part of the civilian domain. So you have most governors of most provinces in Sri Lanka, and particularly the governor in the north and the governor in the east, being army officers. And so we're very, very concerned that while Sri Lanka remains on the surface a civilian democracy, beneath the surface there's a kind of a military coup, a coup within a coup with the same president taking place.
Now, I would imagine the Sri Lankan government's rationale for a large security apparatus is that it was a particularly brutal civil war, and they want to make sure that separatist militancy doesn't reemerge. Given how vicious the rebel liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam were, not only to Sinhalese but to even Tamils, is that not a justifiable concern that they want to they want to increase the military presence to make sure that such a situation doesn't arise again?
I mean, there were 200,000 soldiers when the war ended. There are 300,000 at the moment, and we hear that they're attempting to recruit 400,000 soldiers in total. I mean, I think the idea that you need an army which is double the size to the army which won a 30-year civil war, I don't think that stands up. And Sri Lanka is now appearing towards the higher end of lists of the countries in the world with the most number of soldiers per capita. So I think this is beyond a sort of understandable paranoia, and this really gets onto the level of military occupation. And even were we to accept that Sri Lankan government rationale, you'd have to question whether that's really what a sustainable peace looks like, and whether a sustainable peace with your enemies still having to be held at the end of a gun is really any kind of a peace at all.
My last question is, I've done a few segments over the years on the Sri Lanka issue, and I've gotten some complaints sometimes from some people in Canada's Sinhalese community over the coverage, and one of their key complaints kind of goes like this, that countries like Canada and the United Kingdom are guilty of their own human rights crimes, that both our countries were involved in the war in Afghanistan, which not everybody agrees with. Britain also was in Iraq. Canada has human rights issues with respect to its native population. There's obviously issues that occurred during the times of British imperialism. And from the perspective of these Sinhalese Canadians, for us to lecture Sri Lankans recovering from 30 years of war while we live distantly away in peace and prosperity is a bit rich. How do you respond to that kind of concern?
I mean, I completely understand where that concern comes from. I think very often there is a double standard. I personally believe human rights are universal, and I myself became involved in human rights through my opposition to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and prior to that, my concern over NATO's behavior in Kosovo. I think that often the West does fail to deal with human rights violations in its own backyard, and absolutely that undermines their credibility. Nevertheless, human rights violations are human rights violations, and I think what you have to be aware of in the case of Sri Lanka is that there are many, many countries around the world that have terrible human rights problems. There are very, very few countries around the world which killed 40,000 of their own civilians in a period of just a few weeks. And I think that there is a difference of scale and a difference of intensity when it comes to the Sri Lankan issue, which means it requires an international response. We have a doctrine now, a doctrine which came in part from the Global South, which was driven by African members at the United Nations General Assembly, the doctrine of responsibility to protect. And that's the duty of every government in the world, to protect civilian life. And I think that does mean that every country in the world has not just a right but a duty to ensure that civilians are protected from harm, particularly when it is harm on the scale that we're seeing in Sri Lanka. I would also say that if you looked at the last Human Rights Council, some of the countries bringing that resolution and voting for that resolution against Sri Lanka, you had Nigeria, you had India, you had Cameroon, you had St. Kitts. These are all countries of the Global South. Today we just heard that the Prime Minister of Mauritius is boycotting CHOGM over his concerns over Sri Lanka's human rights record. So I also think it's something of a false flag for the Sri Lankan government to claim that criticism only comes from the West. They're increasingly being criticized by their colleagues in the Global South. And finally, Sri Lanka is no longer a less developed country. Sri Lanka is now a middle-income country. So it can only play this card for so long and at the same time try to claim to be a developed country.
Fair enough. Well, Fred Carver, Campaign Director of the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.